And congratulations to the group for the forum. One of the most undervalued things we have, I think, is genuine, serious, political policy discussion in forums such as these. So I think it's to great credit to the group to put it together. I do appreciate the invitation. We've heard a little bit about the Greens today, so I thought I'd better put my Greens badge on after the first session. I was out on roadside this morning because we are trying to get some people over the line in several electorates around the place, and certainly our Senator Larissa Waters. When you see what the pundits say the last spot is likely to be in the Senate, I think you can see that it's a very interesting election that's shaping up. Look, I started my whole career has been in science. For 30 years, I was a scientist in Michigan and the States. I only became interested in politics and policy at all in the last few years because I simply could no longer read reports about the challenges that we face on this planet in terms of our resource depletion, our ecological destruction, and our very, very poor outlook for the future across so many domains without, in the end, getting off the fence and getting out there and trying to do something about it. Now, I stood as an independent first. I found that I had got nowhere, as unknown independents do, and decided, having met folks across the spectrum, that it was worth joining the Greens because while I didn't agree with absolutely everything, they were certainly the closest in terms of their philosophy to my own thinking. And I have to tell you, having been in academia and dabbling my toes in the political waters, I can tell you there are some very distinct differences. For me, it's always been science first and policy based on science second. But let me say also that, in academia, you have to specialize. In fact, the story about the typical PhD is somebody who knows, because of the virtue of their concentration and their focus, more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing. And the pressures in politics, I can tell you, if you're a spokesman for a party, like I was in the last 2015 state election, is exactly the reverse. So politicians seem to be people who know less and less about more and more until they know nothing about everything. So it's a very different thing. But look, we had some very important challenges to the Greens in the earlier session, and I take those seriously. I think they are very important challenges. I will not dodge them. I will come back to them. So I will address them before I finish. And they are important challenges, which I will take on board. But I want to say a few other things first, and that is that if we had a person from another country observing this discussion today and seeing a debate between the Sustainable Australia group and the Greens about policy, I think they would say this is something like a debate between arcane aspects of theology between Eastern Orthodox and Greek Orthodox. This is not the main game. The main game is that our planet is under attack, essentially, from many different fronts. Our enemy is certainly not each other. Those of us in the more progressive end of politics, and those of us who work in conservation and other groups, need to do everything in our power to be banding together, working together, and supporting one another. And I challenge you, if you take the policies of the Sustainable Australia Party and lay them side by side against the policies of the Australian Greens, there's 95% overlap. There is 95% overlap, and we must support one another. And maybe in the future, there'll be opportunities to further that overlap even more. And for example, I heard from Crispin that we have no population policy. Well, there's a 2-page policy on the web, so I do encourage you to take a look at that. There are some misapprehensions. Anyway, let's move on, because I think the real people we have to fight are those whose interests are contrary to those of the planet and our future civilization. And I think it's very telling that we have a lot of discussion about the Greens today, but we had no mention of our true political opponents. I think there's an imperative to change our current government in the short term. And let me just say that if we want to talk about policy based on science, let's just think back a few months to the reception which the IPCC report, the latest IPCC report, received from our nation's leaders. The Prime Minister of this country, when asked if, on the light of the report, that whether there'd be any effort to reduce emissions to the 26 to 28% from 2005 levels, any effort there, Morrison said, no, we won't. We're not held to any of them at all, nor are we bound to go and tip money into that big climate fund. We're not going to do that either. I'm not going to spend money on global climate conferences and all that nonsense. Well, there's one cross against science for you right there. The Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, also said he understands the concerns of the IPCC report, but then admitted he had not read it. The Environment Minister, Melissa Price, suggested that the 91 scientists behind the IPCC report had basically got it wrong. And I don't know how you could say that by 2050 you're not going to have technology that's going to enable good, clean technology when it comes to coal, she said, and then acknowledged that she had not read the whole report. So if we want to look at people who do not have our interests at heart, we need to look no further than the leadership of the current government. That is my sincerely held view. And if that's a strong political point, I mean to make it quite deliberately. So I think it's an insult, actually, to the electorate to take the view that science, especially science, which was developed at the behest of world governments specifically to inform policymakers, is then ignored by those very same policymakers. Now, on to some issues about population and sustainability. On the very specific matters of population size and population growth, there is simply no question that this Earth and our country and others have some form of carrying capacity that is limited. I think, in truth, genuine academics who understand these issues far better than I, discussing this, would probably, in quite good faith, have disagreements about the extent of that carrying capacity, particularly if it is expressed in an overly simplistic way as purely the number of people in the country, which I don't think most people in that field would do anyway. So carrying capacity, there are limits. There are clearly limits. Perhaps we don't all understand exactly where those limits are. I have to say that the very first line in the Greens population policy, which yes does exist, states that the current population and population growth of this country is outstripping our ecological capacity. And I think there's a general acceptance of that, even if we may disagree on some of the specifics. The issue about growth of population, I think, is really fundamental. And I'm prepared here to say that, as a member of the Greens, I would be very pleased to take to the Queensland Greens initially and then on upstream to the federal Greens, the notion that we reconsider issue about some aspects of population policy, particularly when it comes to growth. I'm actually quite persuaded by the arguments that Jane, in her academic work, and we've just seen Cameron go through, make about the costs for infrastructure demands of population increase rates, because they do pull away resources from the kinds of improvements we may be able to make across the board. I think that is a very genuine, a very legitimate argument. And I think that's one that we in Greens probably should consider more fully. And the specific aspect of our policy, which I believe I would like to see reconsidered, and a point was made from the floor earlier, that in the Greens we do a policy from the bottom up. And anyone here could join in the next month, and the month later be putting up policy ideas. And that is to revisit the idea of the coupling between our targets, which are quite large, for refugee migration and our total migration policy. I think that's a very fair criticism, and I think it's one the Greens ought quite reasonably to, in my view, reconsider. I'll be very happy to take that forward, because I think we actually don't have any advocacy for big Australia, despite what people say. The only single number in any of our policies is about refugee intake. It's not about the total size. And the total size is something we can discuss and agree on, I believe. So let's just say a little bit more, though, about this, because it is not, I think all of us would probably accept, it is not just sheer numbers. The impact which people have is thoroughly dependent upon their call upon resources and the impact of those calls. So when we look at this, we can say that four things that I'd like to address. First, I think we have to radically overhaul in this country urban planning, development, approval, for all the reasons that previous speakers have said, including corruption. And a fantastic book. I loved your book, Cameron. We've really got to tackle this. We cannot leave it. Even if there was zero population growth, we need to tackle it, because we just do planning and development extremely badly. And as an experimental scientist, it's my view that we should actually be bold enough and smart enough, as the words which you used in an earlier talk today, to actually experiment with this. And in North America, there are a number, and in Europe in particular, there are a number of communities that are experimenting with very radical ideas about how they plan their urban communities, not including only the physical infrastructure, but also the governance of those communities. And they're undertaking, I think, some very interesting experiments. We could imagine, and I think we could imagine in a city such as Brisbane, there may be suburbs that we could persuade the community to engage in a multi-year experiment given very specific criteria about energy efficiency, transport, resource use, waste streams and the like, to say, please try to come up with a plan for your community. We will tip some money in to help redevelop this whole particular identified suburb to meet those goals, but only if it's driven by the community, because it has to be accepted by them. So that's one thing I think we could consider. But we must be bolder about this. We can't just go on as we have been. Every possible effort to rein in wasteful transport must be considered. Australian cities have got to really look harder at integrated public transport systems, ways of reducing car dependency. You know, until this wonderful idyllic future of shared autonomous vehicles is upon us, which may reduce the need for individual car ownership, we've got to take the best examples from around the world, whether it's a city like Vienna with its multiple forms of transport, or cable cars in some of the South American cities, or I'm doing quite a lot of work in India at the moment. You know, Delhi is the national capital region, has 28 million people now. And in 1998, they started to build a metro system. They now have a metro system which has 344 kilometers of tracks, 7 lines, 250 stations, ranks 8th in the world for system length, and has an annual ridership just shy of 1 billion people. And I can tell you, if you visit Delhi today and try to imagine what that place would be like had they not said, we are going to get serious about public transport for this community, it would be impossible. It would just grind physically to a halt. Now, that's not the solution to everything, but there's a certain courage in a government that says we are simply going to do this. We are just going to do it. And it's a great pride to those folks who live in Delhi that the thing works as well as it does. We must look closely at the future of farming and food production. I read an excellent book recently by Gordon Conway, 1 Billion Hungry, Can We Feed the World? And he provides a comprehensive kind of analysis of many of the issues and a prescription of about 24 things that he believes we could do. And I'm not an expert in this, but I went to the Farmers for Climate Action conference in Stanthorpe 2 weeks ago, and let me tell you, there are a lot of very progressive ideas in the farming community that we need to be supporting. To his list, I would add that we must consider a serious effort to move away from excessive meat consumption on the planet, not only for our health, not only for animal welfare reasons, but clearly to reduce the burden that animal agriculture places on the world. I read a paper in the PNAS this last year. It was by Bar-Ona, Phillips and Maloa, The Biomass Distribution of the Earth. There's an effort to try to understand what the various different animal and plant types weigh, basically, how much they weigh, how much the different types weigh. Well, humans have grown, of course. One of the most astonishing statistics I saw in that is if you take the whole weight of all the world's wild mammals, according to this research group, it is outweighed by domestic livestock, almost entirely cattle and pigs, 14 to 1. 14 to 1. I don't know if that, I can't vouch for that number, but these are serious scientists, and I think that's a number that should shock us. Because if you think of how that translates to things like fodder production that's shipped around the world, in the eastern Brazilian plateau, where soya is grown to make fodder for cattle to feed us, this is a stupid way for us to be behaving. Okay, moving on. Every bit as important and a much greater and more complex challenge is that we have to strive to transform not just our own economy, but the whole economy, the global economy, to a much lower flow of physical materials, whether these are for consumer products, clothing, vehicles, construction materials, and other goods. It's excessive production, distribution, consumption, and disposal of materials that drives environmental damage in the end. Not just the numbers of people, but the numbers of people multiplied by those processes. Now, this is very challenging because there have been studies, for example, that show in the city of Stockholm, where population is not growing, consumption and use of materials is still growing. So it's no guarantee, it's no panacea to simply put a stop to population growth. That's not necessarily the whole story. But there are also some very serious issues related to international trade. International trade, globalization, is responsible for a very much larger proportion of material flows around this planet than is our domestic economies. And an amazing, according to one study, 40% of that material flow is never even exported. It is to make new facilities to help in export. Consider the Adani coal mine. I did some calculations to roughly estimate what is the energy equivalent of just the steel for the rails, for the track, to get the coal from the mine to the port. And it is staggeringly big. It would power approximately 800,000 Australian homes for a year, the energy equivalent of making the steel for that. So the whole globalization phenomenon, well, while it may have alleviated poverty to some extent, has also cost us dearly in terms of its effect upon the planet. And we must consider this and find ways in the next decades to make changes. So finally, I really do congratulate this group for taking so seriously the problem of population, which of course is part of a broader issue of sustainability, although it is prominent, I think it is fair to say, in this group. Population growth, when it's uncontrolled, is indeed a very dangerous thing. However, my biggest fear is that when we get to the end of this century, and you consider a child born in Brisbane today, who could in the normal course of events reasonably expect to live into his or her 80s, and see out the end of this century, we are forecast, according to the United Nations, to have approximately 11.2 billion people on the planet. Let me tell you, my very, very serious concern is not that we will have 11.2 billion people on the planet in the year 2100, but we might have 5 or 3 or 1 billion because of the devastating effects of the way that we are running the planet. That there could be massive migration, conflict, resource wars. In India, I have just witnessed many thousands of people moving in each year to take work in the big cities. This is just now a fact of life. So these pressures are absolutely enormous. The ecological destruction that we are waging on the planet by virtue of the way that we conduct business is simply not acceptable. We have to put an end to it. Thank you.